Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined by Master Sanders again to continue our series on More Than Reactionary Biblical. Today we're discussing the issue of race and how it is in the Bible, applied in the Bible. Now, the term race, as we think of it today, with all the sort of ideological baggage and concepts in it, are not really present in antiquity. Now, the idea of ethnos or an ethnicity, which is more or less a descendants sharing a common familial patriarchal ancestor, yeah, that existed. And to some extent, the modern conception of race is derivative of that. But again, the modern conception of race has certain connotations and baggage with it that doesn't lead to an easy one-to-one correspondence. Now, if we look at the Bible, how is a nation or a people or an ethnicity defined? Well, it's essentially an extended family. So with the table of nations in Genesis chapter 10, we read that Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all produced sons, and those sons produced sons, and they became nations. So Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 6, says, now they were the grandchildren of Noah, in honor of whose names were imposed on the nations by those first seized upon by them. Japheth, the son of Noah, had 7 sons. They inhabited so that beginning at the mountains Taurus and Amanus, they proceeded along Asia as far as the river Tanasis, and along Europe to Cadiz, settling themselves on lands which they light upon, which none had inhabited before. They called their nations by their own names, for Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call the Galatians, but were then called Gomerites. Magog founded those that were among him named Magogites, but whom by the Greeks are called Scythians. Now as to Jovan and Madai, the sons of Japhet, from Madai came the Medians, who were called the Medes, and by the Greeks, but from Javan, Ionia and all the Grecians are derived. And he continues in that vein for a while. So a nation is really someone that can trace their lineage to a certain patriarch that defines them in a certain way. And we see this in Genesis with the birth of Jacob and Esau. And we see that each one of them are given genealogies of their descendants, their rulers and their people. And what sets them apart is their actions. Now, ultimately, even though Jacob he's kind of a Loki trickster figure, and has a very sketchy behavior overall, he is faithful to God in the important things and serves God, unlike Esau, who serves his own appetites. And so we see that the sort of national identity of the Hebrew people begins with, well, actually Abraham, but further more specified Jacob, because of course Abraham had a son Ishmael, who later became the descendants of the Arab peoples. So we see that now in the case of the Old Testament, it's the Jews, their patriarchs were marked by their faithfulness to God, and that's the defining characteristic from what they descended from. And at the end of Genesis, in Genesis 50, I mean, really, Israel is just 70 people. It's Jacob, his 12 sons, their wives, their children, and their attendants, as well, of course, as Joseph and Asenath. So a family is a nation. And this is a view that's, of course, echoed in Aristotle. It was common at the time to view a nation or a state or city-state as just an extension of a familial unit. And so the biblical definition of a nation is a family. And as we saw with Jacob, at one point it was as few as 12 people. And then it eventually grew to be more than the sands of the sea. So this modern idea that, okay, there's my little family here, and there's like this firewall that keeps everybody else out, is a very unbiblical idea. People who are not your necessarily direct blood relatives, but you're descended from a common patriarchal ancestor, under the biblical definition of a family, are still your family and still your nation. So I think that's where I want to start with. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, and I think the problem is with that is that you can also extend that to a much broader definition in terms of all being descendants of Adam, and then maybe a little more specifically Noah. But going back to what you were saying about families, this is actually in terms of this this commonality and yet separation between different families, different nations, is actually touched on in Acts 17. So in his address to the Areopagus, Paul says, referring to God, he says, He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So Acts 17:26, according to the New King James Version. And people on both sides of the debate, those that emphasize more of a racialism and those that de-emphasize race or ethnicity, tend to miss or they tend to miss the dual aspect of this. So, for example, yes, God has made from one blood all the nations of the earth. So we all have a common ancestor, that being Adam. But we also have distinctions between us as defined by where we have lived. So, as he said, he had made those people live in their times, or sorry, in their places according to pre-appointed times. And so, there is a level of unity among mankind, but there's also a level of distinction. This level of distinction is not just arbitrary or cultural, but one that God himself seems to recognize in just the fact that he chose the Jews specifically when it comes to his plan for the world. And even then, this difference on a racial, but as well as a religious level between the Jews and the other nations of the earth is recognized by the Bible. So I think if as Christians, if we are going to approach this issue, we're going to have to acknowledge this sort of dual aspect of humanity, and when it comes to his genetics. On the one hand, as you said, Todd, we have nations that are based off of a common ancestor, whether it's going back far as biblical times or even to our immediate family, as well as the broader family of man, in that we all come from the same ancestor of Adam. So for a Christian, we have to have that dual recognition and not ignore one at the expense of the other.
Exactly. And in fact, the usage of the Greek word ethnos in Acts 17:26, which we translate as nations, and according to the BDAG, means a body of persons united by kinship, culture, and common traditions. So we see then that, again, all of this is wrapped up in an idea of a family and an extended family. And one of the things, if you look at Paul, when he says that if one does not take care of the members of one's own household, one is worse than an infidel. Well, what could household mean? Now, in the New Testament, household can mean a building, a literal building, house. It can mean the members of that house, the servants, the stewards, the children, the parents. It can mean a nation. So when Christ says to the Syrophoenician woman, I came to the lost sheep of the household of Israel. So Israel itself is considered a household, as is Satan's kingdom. A house divided against itself cannot stand. So in what context can we take Paul when he says the members of one's own house? Now, obviously, he's referring to your parents. He says if one does not take care of one's own parents, one is worse than an infidel. So in that sense, but you see, we have to ask ourselves, would any first century Jew or Gentile have conceived of a filial obligation ending with your immediate parents? No. Nobody would have conceived a household in such a narrow modernist sense. They would have understood it to mean a nation. And I think we have every reason to think that Paul is not only including your parents, but also your, in some loose sense, your nation. And one of the reasons why I think we have to do that is when he talks about the use of the term flesh, sarx. Now, in Ephesians 5:29, he says that no man hated his own flesh. Therefore, he should love his wife, because they are now one flesh. And so he uses the example of a certain kind of relationship, i.e. that of a husband to a wife, to refer to how you treat yourself and how you treat yourself physically. Now, Paul uses exactly the same term with the same case in Romans 9:3. I wish I was accursed for my kinsmen of the flesh. He's using flesh in an analogous way to loving one's wife. And yes, your wife is independent of you. Your people are independent of you, but you share the same flesh. Now, what's interesting is your wife isn't necessarily from your same tribe. For example, we see with Uriah the Hittite. He's a Hittite, his Canaanite, and his wife is a Jew. But even in that situation, right, Paul would say she's your flesh. Well, how much more is someone of your flesh if they really share the same DNA as you do? Even more so, this attitude of self-anathemization for your people is expressed in Moses in Exodus 32:32. And of course, God says in Exodus 32:33 that the soul that sins shall die. And so Moses, you can't actually do that. But what Paul is expressing in Romans 9:3 is the same view of Moses. And it shows that attitude of Moses was not an Old Testament fad that was passing away. It's still present in the New Testament. And so if you look at flesh used that way to describe your wife, and she doesn't even necessarily have to be someone of your same tribe, so that she might have different DNA than you, how much more so would that relationship hold to people who share the same DNA as you? Much, much more so. And this is an idea that's just common sense and self-evident. The commentary on Romans 9, verse 3, by the late, great nonconformist Matthew Henry, he writes, "Because of their relation to them, my brethren, my kinsmen according to the flesh, though they were very bitter against him upon all occasions, and gave him the most unnatural and barbarous usage, yet thus respectfully does he speak of them. It shows him to be a man of a forgiving spirit, not that I ought to accuse my nation of." Acts 28:19, my kinsmen. Paul is a Hebrew of the Hebrews. To them we lie on our special engagements, and we have more opportunity of doing good to them and concerning them, and our usefulness to them we must in a special manner give account. Yes, in a special manner, in a filial obligation. That's exactly how Paul views it. And I like what Matthew Henry brings out here. The Jewish people abused Paul tremendously. And unlike being a race cuck and a sellout, Paul did not turn against the Jews and say, "Oh, well, screw you people. You turned against me. You rejected the Messiah." No, he still has a tremendous amount of affection and concern for them. And furthermore, Matthew Henry does not take this to be a special view that only Jews have towards one another within the covenant dispensation. You could imagine some mainline Protestant or some evangelical saying, "Oh, well, that was just for Jews back in the New Testament." No, that's not how Matthew Henry read it. It's how nobody read it that way. That's this completely, progressive Marxist concept that you don't have these kinds of obligations, right? What we have is the individual's relationship to God, the individual relationship to his wife, individual's relationship to his church, and then the whole world. Wait, whoa. There's like intervening steps here, and we just skipped all those steps. So that's a lot to chew on. Do you have anything to add to
that? Two things. One, you were talking about the use of ethnos and then of house. I think the word in Greek is oikos, used in reference to both a family and a household. A similar distinction, interestingly enough, is made in Hebrew with the word bayit. So when God says that he is going to build David a house in 1 Samuel, he says, 2 Samuel, he uses the word bayit. So I'm going to, instead of you're building me a house by bayit, I'm going to build you a house bayit. So that similar pun and meaning is understood. So whether it's the house of David, the house of God, the house of Israel, they all have that same, quality of a household, family, and nation. It works in that as well. And I would dare to say that most ancient languages probably use or have a similar understanding to household, just based on how families were structured back then. But going back to racial obligations, it would be tempting to look at Jesus in the writings of Paul and see that, well, because they are dealing with Jewish ethnocentrism, that they're somehow doing away with race. And in fact, there's a couple of sections in both the Gospels and the writings of Paul that seem to imply this. So, for example, Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, says, "Who is your neighbor?" It was the Samaritan, somebody who was hated by the Jews. He goes to the synagogue one day and he praises the faith of the widow that Elijah visited, or Naaman, who visited Elisha. And it seemed to be implied from the text that the Jews were ready to stone him because he was bringing up the Gentiles as being superior in their in their faith as to that of the Jews. Or if you look at the writings of Paul, and Paul talks about um, there in Christ there's no Jew or Gentile, and Paul seems to be hammering a lot on Jewish ethnocentrism in an attempt to uh, blur the distinctions, interestingly enough, between Jews and Gentiles. But I think this is sort of an anachronistic reading into the text. This is not to say that Paul and Jesus were not concerned with ethnocentrism, but they weren't abolishing the idea of race entirely. Jesus himself affirmed the necessity of familial obligations, even though he said things like, those who gives up father and mother for me, the same will have more in the kingdom. But he does criticize the Pharisees for uh, using their donations to the temple as a way of avoiding their obligations to their father and mother. And likewise, going into Paul, talking about no one hates their own flesh, nowhere does Paul say that your obligations to your family somehow end when you become a Christian, as if you're part of a new family to the exclusion of others. That's what cults do. But what he's saying is that children obey your parents. He says wives who are married to unbelieving husbands and vice versa. He tells them not to divorce each other unless they seek it. And you got to keep in mind, most of these people that have joined the church did not join as families as per se. They joined as individuals, often at the exclusion of their families. So he's saying that even then, when they're part of the new family of God, this new people of God, you're not suddenly absolved from your obligations to your immediate family. And so, based on what Paul said about uh, the way he felt about his own people, the Jews, who you would think he would have every reason to say that, like, well, since the Jews rejected Jesus, God doesn't care about them as a unit anymore. In fact, that's actually what a number of anti-Semites say. But nevertheless, Paul says that he wished he was, as you mentioned, like Moses, wished himself accursed for his own people. So if Paul tells us on a number of occasions to follow him in the way that he was following Christ, I think that it's not a jump for Christians today to say that they should feel strongly about their not just their immediate family, but their broader national family in the same way that Paul felt about his broader national family, that being the Jews.
Exactly. And also, in like manner, when John, I think it's in First John, says, "If you do not love your brother whom you have seen, you cannot love God whom you have not seen." Now, obviously, as Christians, we're supposed to have concern for the welfare of all people, to call all people to Christ, because he will have an inheritance of every tribe and tongue and nation. But at the risk of some oversimplification, one cannot love the people of the world if one does not love one's own nation. And for the same reason, one cannot love God if one does not love one's brother.
Exactly. And again, we see throughout the Old Testament that God does seem to have a concern for people outside the Jews. In fact, the story of Jonah is an excellent example in that, or that he wants the Israelites to remain distinct from the nations so as to draw the nations. Right? I think that's the ultimate purpose for why he kept the Jews and insisted that the Jews be remain separate. Of course, that's why you do run the risk of overstating it either way, of blurring those distinctions. But the Old Testament does anticipate, as it says in Isaiah 56, that my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. But the implication is still all nations. The distinction between peoples is still there. And I think as we look at even the apocalyptic literature of both the Old and New Testament, there doesn't seem to be, even in the millennium, a distinction between an erasure of distinction between nations. In fact, they seem to continue to exist as ethnic units, and God will judge the nations as larger, broader units. And I think that comes to a problem that Christianity does seem to miss today, especially evangelical Christianity, is that we are very concerned with individual salvation and individual accountability, our lives as individual Christians, which is not bad in and of itself, but we do miss certain levels of corporate responsibility and corporate obligations. And, even if not just to the family, but to our people as well. And so while I would be very, very cautious about incorporating ideas such as nationalism completely into Christianity, the nationalist concern for one's people is not necessarily contrary to Christian ethics and what we would do.
Exactly. To further sort of drive home the point about house, is if we look at in 1 Timothy 5:8, the passage where Paul says, if one does not provide for his own, especially those of his own house, he has denied the faith and is an infidel. Now, the term house is derivative of oikos, oikoion, and in the BDAG, oikos has oikios rather has two possible meanings, but the main definition is persons who are related by kinship or circumstances and form a closely knit group, members of a household. And then it says A, with focus on normal familial connections or associations in common of members of a household. And then B, with a group with a focus on association, a common cause or belief. Now notice, one is a blood tie, one is a shared set of values, but the usage in 1 Timothy 5:8 is of the A variety, which is a blood tie, which further strengthens the idea that we're not referring to brothers in the faith, fellow Christians, because we're not necessarily related by blood. We're related by a common shared belief in Christ and his mission and work. So that also would exclude the secondary meaning of okios. What it does mean then is a nation. And if we look at the household of Israel, we see with Matthew 10:6, again, this sort of ethnic meaning, a whole tribe, a whole clan or tribe of people descendant from a common ancestor. So what is a nation? What is a household in that usage according to the New Testament? People descendant from a common ancestor by blood. And what is a house used in 1 Timothy 5:8? People related by blood. Wow, do the math. What do we end up with? A nation. So, and again in Romans 9:3, we know Paul boasts hyperbolically of being of the tribe of Benjamin, and being a Jew of the Jews, the Hebrew of the Hebrews, circumcised on the third day, and all these things that make him so awesome as a Torah observant Jew. And he views other Jews as his kinsmen. Also, so does James. James, who's a tribe of Judah, brother of Christ, writes the book of James to the lost tribes of Israel. And he considers them kinsmen. So it's not just, oh, they're your half brother. No, they're still your brother. I mean, technically, they're still your kinsmen. So technically, Joseph was the half brother of Reuben. But, they're still of the nation of Israel. So that doesn't destroy that connection. And filial obligations scaled up towards nationhood. Again, that's just universal. Aristotle taught that in the Politics. We read this in the Bible. This is, if there is anything we could consider a perennial tradition, that's it.
Which that might indicate, and of course, the common beginning when it comes to, much like when you see stories of the flood having a similarity, but that's a discussion for another time. But I want to take this a little bit further as to one problem I think I do see within evangelical Christianity today is the problem of missions. Now, within the realm of missions, if you're going to be an effective missionary to a foreign culture, you have to a certain extent become a race, for lack of a better word, a race realist. Right? You have to, in order to communicate the gospel effectively in a foreign culture, you're not necessarily going to adopt or take Western understandings of the gospel and preach it to them, because they're not going to get it. So like when missionaries go to the Muslim world, they don't talk about terms of guilt and innocence. Those are Western conceptions. They use terms such as shame and honor, which are much more prevalent in those cultures when it comes to understanding sin. So you have to a certain extent acknowledge that there are differences between people groups, whether it's even if it's just on a cultural level, when you are going to different cultures. to spread the gospel. So there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance, though, I think, that even with that understanding that you have to acknowledge those differences in order to be a much more effective preacher in a foreign culture, that you at the same time ignore that those differences are real, at least when it comes to a domestic sense. W- I have had done similar projects, not necessarily abroad, but with different ethnic groups in the United States, specifically my local area. And not to power level too much, but there was this one Asian group that I was working on a project involving how we could reach out to them. And this Asian group was predominantly Buddhist. So within this Asian group, they had established a church that was predominantly from this Asian group, and that was attached to a predominantly white church, which had its own set of problems, but we'll get to that. Well, that's a discussion for another time. There was one person I talked to who was from this Asian group, but she attended the white church, and she wanted to attend the white church. She wanted to be part of that culture. And then she, according to her own testimony, said that she felt led by the Holy Spirit that she really needed to be with her own people and minister to her own people within the church that was established for them. So she left the white church and joined the Asian church. And that actually got me to thinking is that I think a problem is a lot of evangelicals within a Western American context. We have a lot of at least expressed concern for those of other people, which is noble, which is noble. I'm not dismissing that at all. But we often do that at the expense of our own. So we talk about how bad, our culture is today, particularly with white culture, and in my case, more of a rural culture that certainly has its share of problems. But we don't want to talk to them. We want to talk to people of a different culture with which we have virtually no relation with. And while I wouldn't dismiss the idea that we should reach out to people of other cultures, I think that we have a primary obligation when it comes to our ministry to minister to our own people. Because even just from a gut level, to put the welfare of somebody else above that of your own family, when you can help your own family, I think most of us would find abhorrent, or at least counterintuitive. But yet, that's what the church has done today. And as a result, American culture, particularly in white America, has suffered as a result.
Yeah, exactly. It's like what Christ said, to the Pharisees: "You should have done these things, but not left the others undone." Also, yeah, you should witness to the world, but you shouldn't have forsaken your familial obligations. One aspect of this is interesting. So in the 90s, there was a revival of In His Steps, the book which inspired WWJD. And of course, amongst Protestant evangelicals and fundamentalists, the discussion is, well, what would Jesus do? Well, apparently they never thought to ask what would Jesus do when it came to missions. Because if you read Mark chapter 7, beginning in verse 24, you find a very interesting view of missions. From there he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. He entered a house and wanted no one to know it. He could not be hidden, for a woman who was a young daughter had an unclean spirit heard about him, and she came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, Syro-Phoenician by birth, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. But Jesus said to her, "Let the children be filled first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she answered and said to him, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the little dogs under the table eat from the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For this saying, go your way, the demon has gone out of your daughter." And then when she had come to her house, she had found the demon gone out and her daughter lying on the bed. Now, what is interesting about this? Well, a lot of things. First of all, who are the children? The children of the Jews. Jesus' ethnic relations. They come first in the priority of missions. And he says, look, he literally calls her a dog, which is equivalent to any number of racial epithets today. So this is like not a light insult. This is about as bad as it gets. Calling someone a dog was fighting words back in antiquity. And so, the Jews first hear the gospel and are serviced by Christ. And then afterwards, the Gentiles are witnessed to. Now, she showed great faith. And so Christ made an exception, right? This isn't a hard and fast rule To sort of paraphrase Pirates of the Caribbean, it's kind of like guidelines. There are some cases in which you can bend it a little bit. And the other aspect is he uses an extreme racial epithet. Modern day culture and modern day Christianity views racial epithets the way we used to view blasphemously using the name of God. To blaspheme the black man is a greater sin than to blaspheme God himself. Sadly, amongst Christians, not just the secular world as well, which shows you how depraved and out of touch we are with what biblical doctrine actually is. Now, obviously, someone might say, well, Jesus came to the Jews, Jesus of the Jews. True, but Jesus' mission was also for the whole world. The prophets say that Christ came to save all mankind. Isaiah says it's too small a thing that I save just the house of Israel. So clearly, but here's the deal. He came to save the Jews and he came to save the world. But in what order did he do it? He started with the Jews. And it makes sense he starts with the Jews because in Acts, Stephen says that, they received the oracles of God. The Jews, even Paul says this. They were the ones that, if you're going to spread the gospel of salvation, you're going to start with people that understand it first. And the Jews understood it better than the Gentiles because, if you tell a Greek, as we saw in Athens, when Paul goes to Athens, like, what are you talking about, Paul? This is idle babbling, according to the Epicureans and the Stoics. And so today, we might say, well, okay, what are current analogies? Well, obviously, white Europeans and white Americans, and I guess to a lesser extent, black Americans, are analogous to the Jews in the sense that we live in this Christ-haunted world. Like, we all think like Christians, even if we're not really Christians. And so the barriers to entry of spreading the gospel are far lower than going to Brazil or the Congo or India or Bangladesh or China. And so what would Jesus do? Well, start with your own people. That's what Jesus would do. And apparently that never quite came through, did it now?
It doesn't seem to. And going back a little bit, what you were saying about Jesus, is that Jesus did similar things with other Gentiles. In fact, he would usually make this point, I have not seen a greater faith, no, not even in Israel. But what's the point of that? I think Jesus is using that to shame the Jews that he was ministering to, who were thinking that they had this special place because God had chosen them. In fact, even when he would answer the petitions of Gentiles, he would do it in reference to the Jews that he was talking to. So you can even argue that his even in dealing with the issues of the Gentiles, he was reaching out to the Jews and was trying to reach them in what he was doing. Someone mentioned in the chat very interestingly, a quote from Paul in Titus, talking about, was one of their own prophets said, all Cretans are liars, which is actually true. That's, I don't remember the name of the philosopher who said that, but that was actually quite, that's it. That's Epimenides.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So Paul, remember Paul, who is a foreign missionary himself, so to speak. He's a Jew who is ministering to the Gentiles, seems to recognize that there are characteristics in different people and different cultures. Now, which actually could segue to another interesting topic. In the debate of nature versus nurture, how much do we attribute to race and how much do we attribute to culture? Can we distinguish the two? And it is a very difficult question. We really don't necessarily have time to entangle all of it. But I will say this. I think as Christians, as Bible-believing Christians, we should not dismiss the idea that certain characteristics, when it comes to race, are necessarily, we shouldn't dismiss the idea that they are communicable in a heritable sense, not just simply a cultural sense.
Well, it's interesting too with the burgeoning field of epigenetics. We sort of see that negative behavioral traits can pass on certain consequences to your offspring, and one could imagine if an entire people group indulged in these negative traits for long enough, it could be a congenital characteristic.
Well, exactly, and there's some more obvious examples like fetal alcohol syndrome. That's a little more obvious, or diseases that can be passed, such as age, that was sexually. So those are a little more obvious, but I think we could even go a little bit further and say the personality is possibly heritable. Um, so let me give you an example. Um, uh, this is a bit more anecdotal, but I remember reading the autobiography of Michael Reagan. And Michael Reagan was the adopted son of Ronald Reagan. And he had never met his family, or at least members of his extended family, up until his, I think, his 50s. And he talks about how when he met his stepbrother, sorry, stepbrother, sorry, his half brother, that he was amazed about not only how much they looked alike, but they had similar mannerisms, similar personality quirks, despite the fact they had never met and they were raised by different parents. So, on an anecdotal level, I think a lot of people can affirm that adopted children, even though they may have significant influence from their adopted parents, still carry over some traits that they may have inherited from their biological parents. So, if we believe as Christians that sin is a heritable trait, we shouldn't be surprised if personality is a heritable trait, and we can extend that even further, which is when going back to if the nation is a family, then we have to acknowledge that yes, there are certain aspects of race that are heritable if we take it by that biblical definition. So, as I said, if you're a missionary like Paul, like modern missionaries, you have to be an effective race realist because you have to understand the behavior and culture of the people that you are ministering to.
Yeah, no, exactly. And without putting too fine a point on it, Jesus and Paul both, however unsettling it might be for our current sensibilities, demonstrated that the strategic use of racial epithets is justifiable. That's something a lot of WWJD types would be uncomfortable acknowledging.
Right, right. And I would be careful to, well, even myself would be careful to say how to apply that. I don't think we should necessarily go around using those epithets, especially when we are called to be uh, agents of peace, so to speak. But it does challenge a lot of our conceptions that uh, the fact that Jesus was actually willing to use a racial slur does seem to at least acknowledge, whether even if it was just a teaching moment, that Jesus and by extension Paul recognized that there were distinctives that just simply went beyond religion or ideology or just or skin color. There's something probably much more deeper than that.
Exactly. And when you look at just the you mentioned Titus as well, Paul's statement about the Cretians. What is so problematic here is this view of radical individualism. Now, in the case of evangelicals and American Christians, because this isn't just a problem for Protestant Christians. You'll see Catholic and Orthodox Christians do the same thing. Oh well, I know this white guy down the street who's part of the opioid epidemic, but I don't care about him. I'm going to virtue signal about going to Ethiopia. Something ridiculous like that. One of the things is, do these people not realize that without the United States, there is no global mission system? And global missions, as we know it, begins with Great Britain. And you see, part of the reason why people like Gladys Aylward, Amy Carmichael, Hudson Taylor did what they did was the assumption was that England and America were already conquered for Christ. They were already under, at least God-fearing, if not actually practicing Christians. And so, furthermore, too, though, in the 19th century, concern for your poor kinsman wasn't ignored either. So the Salvation Army, right, was created to help, poor people in America. So not just foreigners, but also domestic white people. In fact, in the book itself that sparked What Would Jesus Do in his steps, in the second half, the minister from Chicago goes to live in the slums of Chicago. And he says, if we all gave up our money to go move to India, nobody would think it's weird. They'd praise us for sacrificing for the kingdom. But if I do the same thing in the United States, they call me crazy. So it just shows you how ass backwards this all is. And if the United States goes under, there is no world missions. South Korea, which is increasingly Christian, will be invaded by North Korea, in which case they won't be able to do anything about it. And no other country in the world has the wealth or the inclination to spread the gospel. So, given that these Christians in America are complaining about the lack of Christian culture, why are we wasting time in all these foreign countries? They're not going to send their money back. They're not going to send their best and brightest back to save America. We need to work in America here to build up kingdom institutions.
Exactly, and for all all the stereotyping of conservative evangelicals that they are just like raw American patriots, they don't really seem to treat it that way. At least in their actions, they don't seem to share the same enthusiasm in ministering to their kinsmen or their neighbors in the same way that they do toward foreign nationals or foreign nations. So we have already. You talk about South Korea. We've already have incidences of people from South Korea actually sending missionaries to the United States. So they've learned a little bit from our example. But yeah, you're right. It's as Christians, we nationalism aside, politics aside, Bible believing Christians should have a concern for their country, especially for the United States, and to see that the United States as a nation becomes God fearing and hopefully becomes conquered for Christ. Before we really begin to stress out about this one obscure tribe in the rainforest of Brazil or Africa. And again, while those are not necessarily bad, and those are indeed noble goals, it does seem to be, at least to me, that we've almost given up on our kinsmen, and that is actually far more concerning in the long run than whether or not we tick off all these appropriate, not racist boxes, so to speak.
Exactly. One interesting question, and I'll post it to the screen here, is from a follower of ours, Ziv, and he says, so do we all belong to different specifications of a family? Adamites, Abrahamites, Israelites, Conan, etc. Well, to answer that question, what I would say is those of us in the actual stream right now are all probably Japhethites, and then more further narrowed down, descendants of Gomer, because Gomer is often considered the ancestor of the Germanic peoples, and also the Galatians, but the Galatians are Celts. So they're essentially Western Europeans that migrated to Turkey, and Josephus gives an account of that. So I haven't looked into how the Bible would parse that completely, but it would seem that Gomer is the sort of like Jacob of the Western European peoples. And in that sense, those of us that are Celtic and Germanic and Anglo and French, it's sort of he's the Jacob figure. Another interesting question about the same guy was how are these principles, i.e., being in group preferences, how would they be applied today beyond missionary work? I imagine most people preoccupied with such issues are more concerned with immigration, race relations, what have you. Well, I think one way you'd actually see this is stop wasting all this money on foreign missions. So really what foreign missions amount to today is just an expensive vacation. You spend, 4 to 6 years in a foreign country, and then you come back. You spend a lot of money. You don't get a lot of work done. You don't. I've talked to people who've done these foreign missions. They don't have anything to show for it. It's just a vacation. Now, again, what makes these modern missionaries different from, say, someone like Gladys Aylward or Amy Carmichael or Hudson Taylor? They all went native. Those people went native. Amy Carmichael went to India with no intention of ever returning to England. Gladys Aylward went to China, as did Hudson Taylor, without any inclination of returning back to England. They literally went native. And that's what you have to do effective foreign missions. So if someone says, God is calling me to India or China or to Congo or wherever, and he's not calling you to live there, that's a virtue signal. You're not doing anything. And then second of all, you'd spend that time doing domestic missions with your house, with your own people. And this is actually where Adventures in Odyssey was actually surprisingly based and woke. They're like, there's this episode where Jimmy Barkley wants to be a foreign missionary. And this one foreign missionary comes to give a lecture at his church. And he's like, oh, no, Jimmy, every aspect of your life is a mission field. You don't have to go to Latin America to be a missionary. You can be a missionary right in Odyssey. And I'm like, wow, you don't hear that anymore, do you, Master Sanders?
Not a whole lot. And going back to one person in the chat talking about how can these be applied. Uh, well, there are similar organizations that do exist, but they're on a very small level. Right? You don't see a whole lot of them. One example that comes to mind might be Jews for Jesus, but Jews for Jesus is also actively trying to present Christianity as being the working within a Jewish context to reach other Jews. So it's not white people necessarily reaching out to Jews. It's Jewish Christians primarily reaching out to other Jews, and that I think could serve as a good basis for something similar to that in terms of ministry that might be racially specific. And in fact, we do this all the time. This is, as I mentioned before, we do this all the time in the mission field. Why couldn't this necessarily be extended to other things as well? So, but going back to your example, you're right. Most of those great missionaries, and I would include there Lottie Moon, to represent the Southern Baptists. They went native. They went to those foreign countries and they went native. And I think that was the understanding back then for most of these missionaries, is that you weren't just going for like 2 weeks. And I tend to think that those sort of 2-week mission trips, or even a week mission trip that often churches and some Christian schools do, I can't help but think that they're ultimately detrimental to what we're attempting to do. Because ultimately, missionaries who are more involved in the nations that they go to, particularly if they're white, they go to places like Africa, and they're treated as if they're like UN or some other benevolent society that's expected to, like, oh, well, I came to bring you the gospel. Like, yeah, but did you bring water, medicine, food, things like that? So missionaries are almost treated. Uh, the benevolence missions that are done by churches to a certain extent hamper the ability of missionaries that are going native in those countries to effectively reach them. And even we look at the ultimate example. What is perhaps the ultimate example of a missionary? Other than Paul, is probably Jesus himself. And what did Jesus do? Jesus was God, and he incarnated himself as a man, and not just as any man, but as a Jew. And Jesus became a Jew to reach Jews. So whether we are ministering to ourselves, to our own people, or we are called to minister to another people, by sort of going halfway and just doing it like, well, half in, half out, without really fully committing to integrating yourself with the culture, and as you said, go native, we're really doing a spiritual disservice to the people we claim to be helping.
Yeah, exactly. And it really kind of goes back to the statement I made earlier. We go from the individual to his wife, to his parents, to the church, and then the world. And I was like, wait, there's a lot of intermediate steps there, and the Bible does talk about that. And also, to answer Ziv's question, another way in which a more in-group preference Christianity would manifest itself is to sort of riff off an earlier stream I did a week ago with the Masonius Rufus, and the importance he assigned to fraternities, masculine fraternal organizations. I think some sort of fraternal organization could also be a parachurch organization that could help develop ties and in-group preferences and help aid your fellow people. No, that would mean there would be parachurch fraternities run by blacks for blacks, in the United States, by and for Hispanics and by and for Anglos. We would do it for ourselves. You wouldn't want to have, a white fraternal organizer organizing a bunch of black guys, because that's not neither one of these are really of the same tribe. So it's not going to work. And it actually hasn't worked, because if we look at the however well-intentioned attempts to help the black man in the South by Northern Yankees, it's all failed. Arguably, black people are worse off now than they were in 1866 after slavery ended, because at least in 1866 they knew who their fathers were. at least in 1866, they weren't shooting themselves up on the street over coke deals. So arguably, it's worse than they were right out of slavery. So again, part of that is, well, these are people that, unless we want to assume the worst, that they wanted to hamstring the black people in perpetuity, which they have done. If we assume a less, more benevolent attitude, yeah, it's just a mismatch. It doesn't fit. And this is, in fact, oddly enough, where black fascists like Marcus Garvey and black ethno-nationalists like Malcolm X are right. They actually refused help from white people but that seems harsh, but I think it actually makes sense because they're like, look, you don't know our problems. We know our problems. Just kind of get out of our way,
And I could actually speak to personal experience from that. Going back to the Asian group I told you that I was working with for a time. In our conversations with them, uh, while this was a group that was, of course, very polite, they would never come out and say it that Whitey's the problem. They did say that their connection with the white church was ultimately what was hurting them in trying to reach out to their fellow Asians. So that's what our job was sort of trying to enable them to be better, uh, be in a better position to reach out to other Asians in their group, because the best people that know their group are those that are within their group. So that was our kind of goal, was to sort of facilitate them in that, but then let them be. The problem is that when we import some of our Western ideas about uh, individualism, and there's no real distinction between that. And ironically, as you mentioned, sort of like with Yankees after the Civil War, is that it actually is far more, if to sound like a normie-con, a far more racist thing to do and far more paternalistic thing to do that ultimately creates a pity and a resentment toward Christianity. So I think, because of that association of Christianity being a purely white phenomenon, that's what led people like Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, and others to embrace their form of Islam as their ethnic religion, right? So I think, and that is often what hampers missions, is the perception that Christianity is a white religion, and that seeks to destroy the ethnic integrity of a certain people. So the best way you can avoid those issues is to enable people within that group to reach other people within that group, so it doesn't come off as sort of like a mighty whitey or the white savior complex. And so it allows for Christianity to be considered something that can be integral to their ethnic group, rather than something that's interloping.
Well, which is kind of funny. This problem was dealt with in Acts with Council of Jerusalem. Some people said, well, the Gentiles have to be just like Jews, the Judaizers. And the apostles are like, no, you don't have to do all these Jewish things to be a Christian. How much of what we just described is essentially kind of crypto Judaizing, where you have to be just like us Anglos to be Christian?
Well, to a certain extent, it has. And the early missionary work did gear itself toward that, where they would basically turn these ethnic groups into Europeans. But even today, while we consider ourselves much more enlightened than that, we still do that effectively. We may not be able to. We bring in our sort of liberal assumptions with us, and it creates that as the sort of militant pity, as one of the commenters said, that ultimately does more harm than good.
Yeah. We're about nearing the end of the hour. Is there anything you'd like to end with before I wrap this up?
Right. So, as Christians, we should demonstrate love for all people. I think that's, whether it's our neighbor, whether it's our family, whether it's the person across the world. We are called to love each other. We are called to demonstrate that love for our neighbor, etc. But I think it's interesting, though, that Jesus emphasizes the fact that we need to love our neighbor. And our neighbor could be someone of a different ethnic group, but I think in most of our cases, our neighbor is going to be one of our kinsmen. As Christians, that's not a justification for hatred of other people, but it does show us that we as Christians, we have an obligation first to the people around us. So, example, Jesus in Acts 1, he told his disciples that you'll be my witnesses for me both in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And so, from our core, from our immediate context, once we get that down, we can reach more and more and more people that way. So if we're going to start with our missions, if we're going to start with our following of Christ in the sense of how we treat other people, how we try to win them over to Christ, how we ought to live, we first need to take care of our own household before we can help the households of others.
I think those are great final words. Thanks again, Master Sanders.
Oh, that was fun, man.
Yeah. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.